Chapter 9. God and the Theory of Everything. If there's an explanation for the origin of the universe, scientists insist, it must lie in the realm of physics. In his book, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking muses about the possibility of discovering a complete theory of physics that will, at last, explain everything. I find one aspect of his approach somewhat disconcerting. He writes, "If we do discover a complete theory, then we shall all, philosophers, scientists, and just ordinary people, be able to take part in the discussion of the question of why it is that we and the universe exist. If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God." By digging deeply enough into physics, Hawking suggests, we'll discover rules that bind even God. The sacrosanct laws of physics, he implies, come first and foremost. Our magnificent human reason will someday triumphantly reveal them all and hold them up to the light like sparkling diamonds that now belong to us. On that glorious day, he claims, we will know the limits physics places on even God himself. Hawking's God strikes me as a kind of super-president of the Royal Society, really smart, but still bound by the laws of physics, and accessible enough to engage Hawking in some really stimulating discussions. Hawking, one assumes, might even make some useful proposals on how to improve the state of the universe, things God might have overlooked when the creation plans were drawn up. The God theory I present here, when coupled with the zero-point field inertia hypothesis, suggests quite a different view. It's not, like Hawking's, a God-limiting theory of the existence of things. It is, rather, an insight into the process of creation itself. How is the physical universe manifested? How are the characteristics of space and time defined? How are the properties of matter created and sustained? My theory, in short, proposes that we regard the laws of physics as the manifestation of God's ideas, not the limits of God's creative potential. A God beyond matter. You spend your life in a world of matter. You encounter solids, liquids, and gases, all of which are just different chemical states of matter. You identify yourself with your body, which also consists of matter. You're so accustomed to equating reality with matter that even if you believe in an afterlife, it's difficult to conceive of it as anything other than a quasi-material reality. The history of religion is full of depictions of God as a supra-material being and of heaven as a literal place. Somewhere amid celestial clouds, or nebulae, there must exist a heavenly palace inhabited by a bearded deity, a curious cross between a stern desert patriarch and a benevolent Santa Claus. In this imagined paradise, God may even occasionally shoot a few rounds of golf with the senior saints in an expanded Garden of Eden, and, if he's Catholic, not Baptist, enjoy a round or two of drinks at the 19th hole at the end of a long day. I state this humorously, and I hope without giving offense, to make the point that any view of God that simply extrapolates from the physical world is a priori doomed to absurdity. Such views are impossibly limiting. The argument for a material God creating a material universe can only take you in circles. After all, if God is made of matter, even some kind of supermatter, then who made that? Logically, you have to postulate an even higher order of creator for your country club heaven. So why not start at the logical starting place to begin with? Go straight to the head honcho. The most fundamental property of matter is mass. Mass makes things solid, substantive, and perceptible to your senses. As I have suggested, however, mass may be an illusion. The characteristic that defines it, resistance to acceleration, may in fact be akin to an electromagnetic phenomenon. This intriguing possibility prompts us to re-examine some very ancient ideas about how the world of matter and the transcendent immaterial realm are connected. How does this physical hypothesis affect our inquiries into the origin and nature of physical reality and the creation and beginning of time? The Manifest God. Let's begin by examining what I call the top-down view of creation. Creation according to Genesis, the Kabbalah, and other religious texts. A clear understanding of this traditional view will help us as we explore what turns out to be the disarmingly similar bottom-up view of creation suggested by the zero-point field inertia hypothesis. In other words, when it comes to creation, top-down is revelation, bottom-up is physics, but it's all the same creation. And just to clarify what really should be obvious to anyone, by referring to God as He, I have no intention of implying anything about gender. God, as the creator of masculine and feminine archetypes and beings, can't possibly be identified with one or the other gender. If the essence of both come from God, they must in some fashion be attributes of God the Creator, the manifest God. I use the term manifest God deliberately to refer to God the Creator. The esoteric traditions tell us that before any beginning and beyond any end, God, the unmanifest, simply is. Period. Nothing more can be said with certainty about this unmanifest God. Atheists, on the other hand, tell us with certainty that God, manifest or unmanifest, is simply not. I disagree. And since it's not my objective to offer proof of what can't be proven, but rather to offer a suggestion of new insight on the origin and nature of the physical world, which in my view a God has created, I'll simply proceed. But it's important to keep in mind that everything that follows is no more than an approximation, an inadequate and incomplete appendix to the one and only genuine fact that ultimately God simply is. The fabric of life is approximation, not certainty. Every day you're confronted with situations, facts, claims, evidence, circumstances, and contradictions. Out of it all, and in the very midst of the circus of life, you draw conclusions as best you can. Is it a good time to invest in a mutual fund? Is it high time to tell the boss goodbye? Should you go ahead and buy that house? Trade in the old jalopy, get married, have kids? Even not making a decision is itself a decision. The insight I offer here is also no more than an approximation, an inadequate and incomplete exposition of my own personal certainty that there is an unmanifest God. God the unmanifest is less than nothing and at the same time more than everything. He's less than zero and simultaneously greater than infinity. Whatever attribute we ascribe to him is wrong, and whatever attribute we deny him is equally wrong. God the unmanifest is neither large nor small, and doesn't exist in space or time. This God creates space and time, and is therefore beyond them. This God isn't merely immortal, but infinite, a God beyond human imagining, whose realm is the absolute. In a state of infinite and unimaginable perfection, above and beyond all space and time, this God simply is. Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart refer to this divine state of absolute blissful being and pure love as the Godhead. Buddhists call it nirvana. Hindus call it Brahman, the Ein Sof. But the very fact that we can imagine this state and define and describe it tells us logically that our perception of it is, if not wrong, at least incomplete. It's a good approximation from which to start, however. According to esoteric traditions, a desire arises in the unmanifest Godhead to experience itself from the point of view of not God. To put it another way, God is infinite potential, but potential, infinite or not, is not the same as experience. So the Godhead desires to actualize its potential and experience it as reality. The unmanifest and trans-infinite God, greater than all and less than nothing, thus transforms into God the Creator, God made manifest. Being becomes doing. The absolute becomes relative. Out of the realm of the absolute, a realm of the relative is created. The realm of the relative is a realm of polarity, hot versus cold, light versus darkness, good versus evil, yin versus yang. Gender is such a polarity, which immediately points out the absurdity of imagining God as one or the other. It takes polarity to make experience possible. Without polarity, experience is impossible. We human beings have fertile imaginations. Imagine dreaming up an elaborate new game, a new and better Monopoly, a wilder Dungeons and Dragons. The idea is the potential. Wouldn't the idea at the same time trigger the desire to create that game, to be able to play it, to be able to fall right into it and act it out? Would our own imagination not also seek the satisfaction of experiencing our mental creation? When do we not want to build what we've imagined? Think of the cyber worlds we're already dreaming of creating someday to experience the most fabulous adventures. Imagine, then, a God of infinite potential thinking, infinite potentials number 43, number 645, number 2146, and number 10,466 worked pretty well together as laws of nature to make that category 6A universe the last time around. That universe was pretty interesting to experience. I think I'll substitute infinite potential number 46 for number 43 and add a little of potential 6,881 this time around and make myself a category 6B universe. Then I'll let part of me manifest as the creator of it and go experience it. Now imagine that infinite potential number 43 is the property of time. Number 645 is the property of three-dimensional space. Number 2146 is the speed of light. Number 10,466 is the value of Planck's constant. These are combined in a certain way in this particular created universe in which we live, but may not be essential elements or foundations of other created universes. While this is obviously a logical possibility, it's difficult for us to imagine and even more difficult for us to prove, in fact, probably impossible, at least in terms of science. Yet this view of the creation of multiple universes with an infinite diversity of laws and properties is essentially the same as Linde's theory of eternal inflation, minus the divine intelligence, of course. Esoteric wisdom holds that the origin of creation lies in God's desire to actualize potential. Since that potential is infinite, it's likely that it would spawn an unlimited number of creations, one of which we happen to inhabit. To create any given universe, God selects a subset from an infinite variety of ideas to actualize and experience. Each universe consists of a subset of ideas that work together and thereby enrich God through a living experience of infinite potential made manifest. I'm aware of the contradiction here. How can one enrich the infinite? That must be regarded as one of the mysteries of creation. It is to me, in any event. Asking God. What I've just described is based on my initial understanding of various esoteric traditions. It was only later that I ran into a series of books that are both intriguing and baffling. Conversations with God. These books claim to be what one might best describe as channeled information, with the source supposedly being God the Creator Himself. This is enough to stretch the credulity of even devout churchgoers, and naturally to evoke the scorn of skeptics. It is, after all, one thing to give lip service to the possibility that God may have once chatted with Moses and his friends. That's far enough in the past to somehow be safely plausible and out of reach. But to co-author a book that sells millions and stays on the New York Times bestseller list is just not what one expects a dignified and distant deity to do. The books are written as a question-and-answer dialogue. As I read them, I was amazed time and again by the answers God purportedly gave and the insights they offered on our supposedly advanced civilization. The description of problems we've brought upon ourselves and about which we delude ourselves daily is probing. The comments on what religions have done and continue to do in God's name is sad but undeniable. The perspectives given on our societal norms, laws, business practices, and government policies are unexpected and damning. Who would expect God to take a dim view of religion, as He does in those books, and the age-old problem of Job, the dilemma of reconciling the existence of good and evil with a supposedly benevolent Creator is resolved in such a remarkably clear way that, in retrospect, it seems self-evident, as truth inevitably does. Of course, I don't endorse the authenticity of Neale Donald Walsh's supposed co-author. Yet the very ideas I've struggled to formulate and express are so well described in Conversations with God that I feel almost foolish to not just use His own words, if such they might possibly be. In any event, they're as good or better than I could do. Here's how He describes this manifest-unmanifest duality. In the beginning, that which is, the unmanifest God, is all there was, and there was nothing else. Yet all that is couldn't know itself, because all that is all there was, and there was nothing else, and so all that is was not. This is the great is, not is, to which mystics have referred from the beginning of time. Now, all that is knew it was all there was. But this wasn't enough, for it could only know its utter magnificence conceptually, not experientially. Yet the experience of itself is that for which it longed, for it wanted to know what it felt like to be so magnificent. Still, this was impossible, because the very term magnificent is a relative term. All that is couldn't know what it felt like to be magnificent, unless that which is not showed up. And so all that is divided itself, becoming in one glorious moment that which is this and that which is that. For the first time, this and that existed, quite apart from each other. From the no-thing thus sprang the everything, a spiritual event entirely consistent, incidentally, with what your scientists call the Big Bang Theory. In rendering the universe as a divided version of itself, God produced from pure energy all that now exists, both seen and unseen. In other words, not only was the physical universe thus created, but the metaphysical universe as well. My divine purpose in dividing me was to create sufficient parts of me that I could know myself experientially. This is what your religions mean when they say that you were created in the image and likeness of God. We're composed of the same stuff. My purpose in creating you, my spiritual offspring, was for me to know myself as God. I have no way to do that save through you. Under the plan, you as pure spirit would enter the physical universe just created. This is because physicality is the only way to know experientially what you know conceptually. It is, in fact, the reason I created the physical cosmos to begin with. This is my plan for you. This is my ideal, that I should become realized through you, that thus concept is turned into experience, so that I might know myself experientially. Now, I will explain to you the ultimate mystery, your exact and true relationship to me. You are my body. Regardless of who actually said this, it's very well stated. And from the perspective of the God theory, the source of these words is not really so mysterious. Walsh is merely conversing with his God nature, something that all of us can do, at least in principle. If the question is it Walsh speaking or is it God speaking, the answer is yes. Yet the problem of how God experiences God is not yet entirely resolved by this view. There's another key to the mystery. If God is all there is, where does creation take place? And how can the Godhead experience itself and its creation externally, since there cannot, by definition, be anything external to it? The answer appears to be that God creates a kind of internal void within which creation takes place. Experience within that creation occurs through created beings who are, by necessity, none other than little flames of the Godhead. The beings that fill this creation cannot be other than God, in an infinite variety of guises and disguises. But for God to experience the game of creation, these beings have to think they're not God. In other words, the Godhead, in the form of its created beings, must forget its own infinity to accomplish its divine purpose of experiencing infinite potential actualized. And who are these forgetful little flames of God? You and I, of course, along with everything else that is, seen and unseen. I quote again from Conversations with God. You cannot experience yourself as what you are until you encounter what you are not. This is the purpose of all physical life. In a sense, you have to first not be in order to be. Of course, there's no way for you to not be who and what you are. So you did the next best thing. You caused yourself to forget who you really are. Upon entering the physical universe, you relinquish your remembrance of yourself. This allows you to choose to be who you are, rather than simply wake up in the castle, so to speak. You are, have always been, and will always be, a divine part of the divine whole. The universe we live in is the actualization of a particular set of mutually compatible divine ideas. Out of an infinite number of possibilities, some self-consistent subset of ideas gave birth to this physical universe. We can make a case that each law of physics corresponds to one such divine idea. The law itself may be a kind of metaphysical thing, a Platonic form, but the processes governed by it are physical. Thought is the first level of creation. In a way we don't yet understand scientifically, thought is energy in its purest form, not just metaphorically, but literally. The universe first existed as a pure divine thought. According to esoteric tradition, this thought became actualized into a metaphysical state. That, in turn, gave birth to the physical universe as we know it, presumably through an event like the Big Bang. Tradition is also quite clear about the existence of an unseen realm that we can call metaphysical, supernatural, or spiritual. This is a higher realm by virtue of being closer to the pure state of the Creator. The Big Bang is thus creation at the physical level, viewed, so to speak, from the inside. Ayin. If we assume that the laws of physics correspond to divine ideas, we can define the rules of the game of creation, but not the creation itself. The laws of physics, the divine ideas, must act upon something to make things happen. Can we possibly understand the nature of this process? The proposed zero-point field inertia hypothesis may provide an insight. In many esoteric traditions, light plays a central role in the creation process. The role of light is discussed in some detail, for instance, in the Jewish mystical tradition. In his book Kabbalah scholar Gershon Scholem writes, "In the abstract, it is possible to think of God either as God himself, with reference to his own nature alone, or as God in his relation to his creation. However, all Kabbalists agree that no religious knowledge of God, even of the most exalted kind, can be gained except through contemplation of the relationship of God to creation. God in himself, the absolute essence, lies beyond any speculative or even ecstatic comprehension. God as the absolute, infinite and unknowable, is referred to as Ein Sof. This is the unmanifest Godhead, before it chose to become the Creator. I use before here in a sense that transcends time, of course, although that's impossible for us to imagine. A corresponding Neoplatonic term for the Ein Sof is Deus absconditus, the hidden God. Ein Sof is absolute perfection without any distinction or differentiation. Its nature is beyond the comprehension of any created being. As Scholem states, Ein Sof, the uncreated and transcendent, cannot be understood by the mind of any created being. It is not in the realm of the Absolute, it is the realm of the Absolute. That realm, he claims, is a kind of state of perfect love. Picture a snowflake with its fine crystalline pattern. Picture an igloo with its solidity. Picture an ice sculpture with its form. Snowflakes, igloos, and ice sculptures are all made from water, which, in its natural state, has no form at all. I suggest that the relationship of the formless element of water to the snowflake, the igloo, and the ice sculpture is analogous to the relationship of the infinite realm of God's perfect love to the transient structures of creation. We can't know the nature of God, the Absolute, but we do know some important facts. We are here. Our universe exists. A creation has taken place. For a reason known only to the Absolute itself, a manifestation has taken place. Kabbalists talk about a divine will and a divine thought becoming present within Ein Sof. A desire of some sort arises, built around a set of ideas. Why does Ein Sof choose to create? Scholem claims, The decision to emerge from concealment into manifestation and creation is not in any sense a process which is a necessary consequence of the essence of Ein Sof. It is a free decision which remains a constant and impenetrable mystery. The Kabbalistic perspective on creation is interesting because in it the emanation of light becomes a central element in the creation process. The Absolute forms a kind of vacuum or void within itself, which the Kabbalists call Ayin. Since this process takes place as a precursor to creation, the void is not a literal void in the sense of empty space as we think of a vacuum. Space itself has not yet been created. A kind of light emanates out of the Absolute to fill this void. The flowing of this light through the void activates the potential within it. The nothingness of the void, heretofore purely potential, is elevated into a manifest reality by this divine light. At the heart of the Kabbalistic creation process, therefore, is light. The $64,000 question is, does this light have any relationship to the electromagnetic zero-point field? I'm very reluctant to equate the two lights because we know very little, and perhaps can only know very little, about the top-down creation process. Moreover, we have so far learned very little about the physics of the zero-point field. There are plenty of books today that blithely proclaim God is the zero-point field. There's no justification for this, however. The most I suggest here is that just as the cosmic microwave background is the faint remnant of the Big Bang, so perhaps the zero-point field is some greatly scaled-down echo of Ayin within the confines of our space-time universe. The light of Ayin creates the realm of the relative, a universe of things that are always defined in terms of their opposites, light and darkness, hot and cold, positive and negative, male and female, good and evil. In contrast to the absolute realm of Ein Sof, we now have a universe grounded in polarity. Indeed, polarity is the very basis of creation. You can't have created things without it. To manifest, God the Absolute must create a realm of polarity. Polarity is also essential to the creation of particles in physics. A photon of sufficient energy can spontaneously transform into two particles. For instance, a positron and electron are created by the annihilation of a gamma-ray photon. Since charge is a conserved quantity in our physical laws, a photon with zero charge must create charged particles in pairs whose charges cancel each other out. The electron's negative charge and the positron's positive charge do this. Nature is capable of creating charges out of pure, uncharged energy, but this can only happen in a polar process, whereby opposite charges cancel each other. This is true for other quantum properties as well. My point here is simply that, in physics, the properties of particles can seem to arise out of pure energy that appears not to possess those properties, provided that the sum of the properties created is zero. This may be the manifestation, in the physical realm, of a key metaphysical law of creation. Esoteric traditions teach that the initial realm of the relative is not yet a physical one, but rather a spiritual or supernatural realm of divine manifestation of polarity. Ultimately, however, the fullness of experience requires a realm of physical matter. The physical realm of one particular creation episode, if indeed there's more than one, is our universe. The transcendent realm of divine polarity, together with our physical universe, constitutes this particular creation episode in its entirety. But in fact, There may be many other creation episodes, perhaps an infinite number of them, as Linda claims in his eternal inflation theory. These other universes would each be comprised of different combinations of divine ideas. This is reminiscent of the Hindu notion of the slumber and periodic awakening of Brahman. You may be tempted to picture these other universes as either previous or subsequent to our own, or as somehow adjacent to it. That error arises, in my view, from our limited human conception of space and time. You can't extrapolate outside this space-time continuum, because there's no empty space and no time of the kind you experience in our universe outside it. If there are other created universes, they are separated from each other in ways you cannot imagine, because your imagination is limited by a conception of space and time particular to this universe. Modern string and M-brain theories raise similar possibilities. They posit that our universe, and perhaps others, may be membranes in a higher dimensional something called the bulk. Of course, there may be many totally different bulks. Let's conjecture that the physical manifestation of our creation episode is the manifestation of space and time, and the energy to inflate them. This appears to us viewing it after the fact, and from the inside, as the Big Bang. Esoteric traditions attribute primacy to light rather than matter, which is intimately connected with space and time. Arguably, matter cannot exist apart from space and time, and is dependent upon them. Einstein's relativity theory also suggests that space and time are defined by the propagation of light. So the key to creation does seem to lead back to light, in the context of both ancient traditions and modern physics. From the point of view of a beam of light, all distance reduces to zero, and all time comes to a halt. While you can argue that no true observer can ever ride a beam of light or a photon to make such an observation, the point here is that the inference of no time and no space for the reference frame of a light beam is a legitimate limit of the transformation equations of special relativity. That much is scientific inference, not fuzzy speculation. A beam of light, or the smallest quantum bundle of light called a photon, moves through space and time at a fixed pace of 186,000 miles per second, at least from your material perspective. From its own perspective, however, there is no space or time. Herein lies what I suspect is a profound connection between the basis of space and time and light in the form of the zero-point radiation of the quantum vacuum. I propose that that light may be the progenitor of an apparent universe of matter, in some sense slowing down ever so minutely from that privileged, timeless, spaceless reference frame of light manifests a realm of space and time. In other words, space and time are created when you leave the reference frame of light. Einstein's special relativity theory tells us that light propagation defines the properties of space and time. I argue that light propagation may actually create space and time. The zero-point field inertia hypothesis implies that the most fundamental property of matter, namely mass, is also created by light. Creation as a timeless process. In the 4th century, St. Augustine, one of the great teachers of the early Christian Church, articulated the view that time was not an infinite pre-existing condition, and that space was not a limitless pre-existing void in which God made matter appear. Time and space, he claimed, came into being together at the creation of the material universe. While this is easy to say, it's essentially impossible for us to actually grasp, since our ability to visualize is based on those very concepts of space and time. We can't really think apart from them. So how do we begin to formulate a thought that doesn't involve space and time a priori? We can imagine a region of empty space, but how can we imagine a true nothingness that's beyond empty and has no extension? How do we imagine a state of true timelessness? Our frame of reference requires that there be a moment prior to the one we're now experiencing, and a moment prior to that, ad infinitum. This leads us down an endless staircase. Where could it stop? And even if it did, how could there not be something below that? Over a decade ago, Stephen Hawking and James Hartle developed a theory in which quantum conditions were applied to the singularity of the Big Bang, that instant at which the entire universe was brought forth from a mere point of infinite density. Hartle and Hawking showed that there was neither a first instant nor a primal point of infinite density. Yet modern astrophysics claims that we can confidently extrapolate the known laws of physics back to the first millisecond. This seems to be close enough to a first instant for all practical purposes. After all, does it make any sense to ask what the universe was like before that? Our universe is now about 14 billion years old. Does it make sense in that context to quibble over less than 1,000th of a second? Human sight and hearing respond logarithmically, not in a linear way. Imagine 5 sound levels: whispering, normal conversation, a screaming child, rock music, and a jet engine. Each of these is approximately 1,000 times louder than the previous one. We perceive these differences as equal intervals because they differ by equal powers of 10. In this case, 3, the logarithm. 3 is the logarithm of 1,000, since 10 raised to the third power is 1,000. 2 is the logarithm of 100. If our hearing didn't respond logarithmically, we wouldn't be able to perceive sounds that range from a screaming child to ordinary conversation to a whisper. The same rationale applies to our perception of light. A typical 3-way lamp lets you set the switch to 50, 100, or 150 watts. Go into a pitch-dark room and flip the lamp switch to the first setting, 50 watts. This brings about a huge change. Flip it again, and the addition of another 50 watts is certainly noticeable, but hardly as dramatic as the change from 0 to 50 watts. Flip the switch a third time to go from 100 to 150, and the effect is hardly noticeable. Adding the same amount of light makes less and less difference to your eye. Adding the same percentage of light, however, such as doubling it each time, yields increments that we perceive as being the same, because adding equal percentages, which doubling or tripling, etc., does, is like adding logarithms. No one knows how time would be experienced under the extraordinary conditions occurring when the universe was 1 millisecond old. There would have been no stable matter, but instead energy flowing every which way, billions upon billions of times more intensely than at the center of the sun. If your perception of time is analogous to your perception of sound and light, however, then your experience of time is also logarithmic. If that's the case, then there is roughly, within a factor of 2, as big an interval between 10 to the negative 24 seconds, a millionth of a billionth of a billionth of a second, and a millisecond, as there is between a millisecond and 14 billion years. This puts a different slant on these apparently infinitesimal times. If we go back almost another equal logarithmic interval, we arrive at a time called the Planck time. This time has significance in quantum physics because it's thought that time becomes indistinct at this level. In fact, what Hartle and Hawking showed is that the dimensions of space and time are not clearly differentiated when the universe achieves the vast energy density of this primordial moment. Although you can project the universe back farther and farther in time mathematically, at around Planck time, time starts to curve around into space, and your calculations begin moving forward in time instead of hitting zero. You have to go further and further north to get to the North Pole, but the moment you pass that point, you're heading south again. No way around it. Thus, in the context of our quantum laws, as we understand them today, there's no zero time in the history of the universe, and so there can be no time prior to zero either. Some argue that this solves the problem of how the universe began, since there was, in this view, no time when the universe didn't exist. This is a neat way to prove that the universe has existed for all time in the past, without actually having an infinite amount of past time. I argue that this is consistent with the esoteric view that creation is not an act in time, but rather a continuous sustaining of a physical universe that we perceive as having begun a long time ago. From the realm of the absolute, it's more like a continuous, eternal, yet atemporal process. God didn't set the universe going and then step aside. God is not the watchmaker deity of the 18th century who winds it up and lets it go. God supports and sustains the universe in every moment in an ongoing act of creation. I suggest that the universe, in its full temporal evolution, is the all-at-once ideation of God. I submit that creation is not an over-and-done thing. The present and future existence of the universe is as much an act of creation as what we call the beginning. Creation didn't happen, it is. Moreover, I propose that the continuous flow of light energy in the form of the zero-point field of the quantum vacuum, in whose reference frame there is also no extension in space and time, may be the mechanism for this ongoing creation. The question from a scientific perspective becomes, can the quantum fluctuations of the zero-point field be the agents that make matter stable and make things happen at the atomic level? Atomic stability and the universal timekeeper. We commonly conceive of atoms as electrons orbiting a nucleus, much like the planets of the solar system orbit the sun. That conception suffers from a fatal flaw, however. Unlike planets, electrons carry an electrical charge, while the huge number of positive and negative charges of the atoms that combine to form the planets cancel each other out. Moreover, a law of electrodynamics dictates that whenever these electrical charges undergo circular motion, they lose energy by emitting radiation. An electron orbiting a nucleus in this classical physics way would therefore lose energy, spiral inward, and plummet into the nucleus in about a millionth of a second, making the atom unstable. It was this very problem that led Niels Bohr in 1913 to formulate one of the first quantum laws leading to the development of quantum mechanics to describe the atom in place of classical physics. We now know that the simple idea of electrons orbiting nuclei may be valid provided you take into account the zero-point field. A recent study of the hydrogen atom by Boston University professor Dan Cole showed that if you let an electron lose energy, as it must according to the laws of electrodynamics, and simultaneously take into account the energy it picks up by constantly being buffeted by the fluctuations of the zero-point field, you can reproduce the complex quantum behavior of the electron in the ground state of hydrogen. For physics aficionados, Cole has managed to reproduce the detailed electron probability distribution of quantum mechanics for the Bohr orbit for a classical electron in a Coulomb field with Larmor emission and absorption of zero-point radiation. It's a major extension of the earlier simple harmonic oscillator models of Boyer and of Puthoff. This intriguing result suggests the possibility that the zero-point field provides the foundation for atomic stability. In 1985, British astrophysicist Sir William McCrea was awarded a gold medal from the Royal Astronomical Society for his achievements. At the event, he presented a lecture that was published as Time, Vacuum, and Cosmos in the Quarterly Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society. In this article, one of my favorite scientific papers, McCrea argues that vacuum fluctuations, the zero-point field, play a fundamental role in physics, primarily in the sense that they make things happen. While McCrea accepts time as a dimension in special relativity, he observes that it's not sufficient. There has to be some agent that shakes things up and makes them go, something that makes the passage of time a dynamic thing. He identifies that agent as the zero-point quantum fluctuations. Consider radioactive decay. Carbon-14 analysis is a well-known way to date the age of fossils that are thousands or tens of thousands of years old. Normal carbon, carbon-12, is an element with 6 protons and 6 neutrons. Carbon-14, on the other hand, has 6 protons and 8 neutrons. It's created when cosmic rays struck the Earth's atmosphere, and it's unstable. That is to say, it's radioactive. That's the key to the carbon-14 dating process. Thanks to cosmic rays, the air, and hence all living things that breathe, contain both carbon-12 and carbon-14 in a fixed proportion. When a creature dies and stops breathing, however, the flow of air stops. There's no influx of new carbon-14, and the carbon-14 already in the body begins to decay to carbon-12. The half-life of carbon-14 is about 5,700 years. That means that after 5,700 years, half the carbon-14 will have decayed into carbon-12. After another 5,700 years, half of what's left of that carbon-14 will have decayed into carbon-12, and so on. Another way to look at this is that, on average, a single atom of carbon-14 will decay to carbon-12 in 5,700 years. Of course, there's nothing magical about that period of time. Some atoms decay in 2,500 years, some in 25,000 years, and some take a minute. The average length of time it takes for a single atom of carbon-14 to make the transition to carbon-12 is, however, 5,700 years. McCrea asked the simple question, what makes that happen? The atom isn't just sitting there watching a calendar, getting bored, and deciding one day that 5,700 years have passed and it's time to move on. How can the abstract passage of time somehow put pressure on an atom to make the transition? What even tells the atom in any dynamic way that time is passing? McCrea suggests that the master clock, the temporal prod that keeps things moving, are the quantum fluctuations of the zero-point field. Carbon-14 decay occurs in the nucleus of the carbon atom. Another kind of transition occurs when electrons in atoms jump from one energy state to another, thereby emitting a spectral line. There are literally millions of such lines from all the elements. A particularly well-known spectral line in astronomy is the hydrogen-Balmer line, a bright red line, 6,562 angstroms, seen in the spectra of many stars and other objects. This line is generated by an electron that has somehow been bumped up into an unstable level of the hydrogen atom electron shells, perhaps by collisions with other atoms. As this electron transitions down into a more stable level of the atom, it emits the hydrogen-Balmer spectral line. This process is called spontaneous emission, and the mathematical probability that governs the process is known as the Einstein A coefficient. Spontaneous emission poses the exact same dilemma as radioactive decay. What's pushing and prodding the electron to make that downward jump? In this case, however, there is more than just conjecture pointing to the quantum fluctuations of the zero-point field. In addition to spontaneous emission, there is also a competing process called stimulated emission. Stimulated emission occurs when photons of just the right wavelength jostle the electron into making the transition. This is the basis of a laser, by the way. Stimulated emission is determined by a mathematical concept called the Einstein B coefficient, multiplied by the number of jostling photons that strike the electron. McCrae pointed out in his article that there's a well-known relationship between Einstein's A and B coefficients. Moreover, with a little bit of algebra, you can show that you can almost rewrite the A coefficient so that it mathematically approaches the B coefficient multiplied by the zero-point field. In other words, spontaneous emission approximates stimulated emission when stimulated by the zero-point field instead of by ordinary photons. The discrepancy that remains is a factor of 2. We can conclude, therefore, that electrons make downward jumps because they're jostled by whatever real photons are around, plus the photons of the zero-point field. And if there are no real photons around, it's the zero-point field that causes all the action. Once again, the universal timekeeper and driver of phenomena may be the zero-point field. In other words, there's good reason to suspect that the zero-point field underlies both the stability and the dynamics of the physical universe. Moreover, it's certainly tempting to view this as a key part of a continuous, sustained creation process.